I will tell you a little story of how Stephen and I met, and it all began on a foggy evening in about 2015. And around 100 people had huddled into a small neon light art gallery in Soho, London, for a discussion about sex robots. It was our very first Virtual Futures salon, titled Fucking Machines. A phrase that wasn't just an expression of frustration towards robots, but also a design ambition for some of the panelists. Seated in the audience was Stephen Oram, a civil servant, at an event about sex robots. Thankfully, I was also relieved to hear that Stephen was a science fiction author, and an accomplished one at that. We'd actually met before in 2013 when he organised a panel at Greenbelt Festival on human enhancement, but he'd kept his science fiction credentials a secret back then. Back in Soho, Stephen and I caught up over a couple of drinks. There was a well-stocked bar at the lights of Soho, and after a few pints, he shared his science fiction secret. By the time the bar was closing, Stephen was our near-future fiction author in residence. It was a night that I don't actually fully remember, but that's what it came of that. And the idea was this. We were finding that folk would attend Virtual Futures events and often comment how the discussion that they were hearing that was a bit Black Mirror. Black Mirror had just launched as a TV series. I think it was on Channel 4. Back then, and because of that, science fiction was really back in the zeitgeist. And already the idea of it being a bit Black Mirror was being used as a noun for the TV show and a verb. This felt a bit Black Mirror. The first event that Stephen contributed to as a science fiction author was an event on neurostimulation, where we both met our panelists today, Dr. Christine Accardi, who at the time was working on the EU project, the Human Brain Project. She was speaking on the panel, and Stephen presented his story as planned. The idea was to have Stephen read a science fiction short story between the panel and the audience Q&A as a way to engage and bring in the audience to the discussion. Little did I know, but at the time that meeting of Christine and Stephen would go on to spark a long-term collaboration between them both, which is something we're going to talk about tonight. Now, realizing that it was 2013, I was just like, it can't be 2013. I've known Stephen for almost a decade, and it's been an absolute pleasure to watch you go from strength to strength and carve out a truly beautiful and interesting niche. And it's an absolute honor to be asked to help him launch his mind-bending new science fiction book, Extracting Humanity, this evening. He has fast become, and he's so modest, but he's fast become British academia's go-to author for disseminating research through science fiction. And this process, applied science fiction, a term that Stephen and Christine have really taken and run with, is what we're going to discuss tonight. So you met at that Virtual Futures salon, and Christine, what is it that made you realize that having science fiction authors and bringing them into projects would be such an important way to bring your research to life?
At the time, I was working for the Human Brain Project as part of the Ethics and Society group. And it was, 2015, 2016, early 2016. So it was over 2 years I was working for the Human Brain Project, and I was starting to become extremely frustrated and disgruntled by the way in which public engagement was done by supposedly professional people doing that. And by the usual imbalance between, you had the expert scientists and the audience, and there was this kind of, the people who were listening to the scientists, and the scientists were the experts with all the knowledge, and that was the way things were usually organized. And that evening on neurostimulation made me realize that, it would be nice actually to have science fiction inspired by the works of the scientists, not just any science fiction taken off the shelf, but directly related to the work of the scientists, used to put as a kind of intermediary, a kind of thing that could mediate between the scientists doing the work and various people. And since Stephen wanted to meet more scientists, that's where we started hatching plans for doing exactly that.
Well, you've done multiple collaborations with Christine, but can you tell me some of the challenges that you have of working with scientists or working with ideas as your raw material for some of your science fiction stories?
Yes, I can.
Good, because we said that on the phone in preparation for this. So.
Yeah, it's like, no,
That'd be great.
No, I can't.
So yeah, there's a few. I mean, it's very different in a lot of ways to just writing science fiction that's just coming out of your head, so to speak. So visiting labs can be quite boring, actually. We went to a fruit fly lab and watching people move fruit flies around with little brushes, But what is fantastic is talking to the scientists and actually seeing the real stuff with real people doing things. So it's kind of really good that it grounds you, but it is a little bit constraining in some ways. That's some of the challenges, I guess.
And Christine, how are you finding some of those scientists responding to folks like Stephen?
It's always, interestingly, a lot of scientists responding very positively. Some were dubious at first, but then when I met with them and explained to them what we were planning to do, why we were doing it, this kind of way to can we, find other ways through science fiction to envision the kind of the implication, the ethical implication, the social implications of future and emerging technologies that you are doing in the lab. After a while, they became usually, they bought it in. And once gone through the process of collaborating with us, I must say, usually are happy by the outcomes that are often surprising, but hopefully interesting, because some of our scientist collaborators in the room. So, but usually there is a bit of kind of doubt at the beginning, but then they are usually the ones that come on board usually enjoy the trip.
So what I would add on I
Yeah.
don't know if it's a challenge so much, but something you have to keep in mind when you're doing this is that you are going into somebody's workspace. You are being given insight into things that aren't yet published. So there's a kind of respect that you have to approach that with in a collaborative manner. Yes, because of those things.
Well, I want to ask you about some of the things you've learned through doing this thing that you've coined, applied science fiction. I think it's a borrowed term, but you guys are really trying to work out how to do that as a method. And one of your first collaborations was with Christine and the European Human Brain Project and also the Bristol Robotics Lab. What did you learn from those early projects that you applied to the way of collaborating with scientists and science fiction authors?
So I think, risk of repeating myself, they're real people and they're doing stuff. And I think one of the things I learned from that particular project that stuck with me most is what you read in the popular press or indeed popular science fiction is a really long way from the reality of what's going on. And I think the other thing I probably started to understand from that one is that coming in as an outsider with a world building storytelling head on, you can start piecing different bits of things together. And that's where I say they're infamous, I think they are, the piss-powered pajamas came from. One bit of the lab is looking at using urine to create power, another is looking at sort of clothing exoskeleton to help old people get around. You put the two together and you've got an old woman who wakes up in the morning, pisses herself so her pajamas will help her get out of bed.
You're very proud of that one, aren't you? So, Christine, I guess the same question to you, because it has been a learning process over multiple years of collaboration. And how have you found working with these scientists, and how are you adapting, I guess, the methods of doing this sort of work?
Well, the first we did with the Bristol Robotics Lab. We just made it up as we went along. I mean, there was no plan. For me, there was no social science theory behind the whole thing. It was like, yeah, let's try it. And but by experience, we learned a number of things on how to do things. And then at some point, we got some pot of money to actually build a project together, funded by the King's Cultural Institutes, where we did spend a lot more time thinking back on what we had learned from our first experiments to start devising a methodology for doing it, and refining things in the process. So it's still experimental, but we are getting better at understanding what we are doing and how we are doing it and why we are doing it. I might have a theory in about a few years that I can actually publish. Well, maybe closer than a few years, but yeah.
Well, is there one key thing, perhaps, if anybody was thinking of doing an applied science fiction project?
For me, there is one key thing that I'm carrying away from all this, which for me is, there are maybe two key things, is that when you actually take science fiction writers in labs and they come out with stories and then you organize events with different kinds of people, there is no expert on the story. Everybody can be an expert. The scientists and the social and the technologists will be experts on the scientific and technological part of the story. But then the writer is an expert on crafting a story. And then the people around, because these stories are usually anchored in social spaces, everybody can be an expert on, thinking about the circumstances of the story. So the idea of having a more level playing field for interactions between these different groups of people has stayed, and has been validated by the work. For me, the other very important thing, and there, I've been trained as a social scientist, but also as a historian of science, is that studies of innovation are something, but studies of technology in use is as crucial for historians. And historians of technology, we always say this is so important to not just look at the moment of the innovation, but how then it pans out. And what these stories are doing are exactly doing this. They are taking the innovation in the future when it's not an innovation anymore, but where it's becoming used by people in a real world, in a fictional real world, and the original intention of the innovation are changed by the uses. And that's what the stories are doing. And that's what is, for me, useful in thinking how, the social implication and the ethical implications of what is created.
Well, Stephen, do you feel like an expert during some of those projects?
I'm starting to feel like more of an expert on how this process works. I'm certainly not an expert in the science or the tech. And I remember sitting in on one thing where I kind of felt like I was hanging on by my sort of mental fingertips. And every time I thought I'd understood something, somebody asked a question. I'm like, okay, I really didn't understand it then. So yeah, an expert in the process, I think. And certainly if other writers, or when I'm doing projects and we're inviting other writers in, there's some top tips, so to speak. There's you are collaborating. Don't forget you're collaborating. Your output is something that in a public reading has to give those scientists some hooks to talk about their work. And it can't be such a point where they're not going to sit on the stage with you. So again, infamously probably from the project with Bristol Robot Lab, we came up with the Black Mirror is okay, Terminator is not. So there's always a moment for the scientists to say, for them basically to have a veto and say, actually, I don't want to be associated with that. So you've got to be prepared to be doing that.
How do you think that method changes? Because you've done other projects, not just with scientists, but with the public. You've done works with Further Field, which actually gave rise to one of the stories in this specific collection. Going from working with scientists to working with the general public and folks like that, or communities, how does the method change?
So I think it depends who. it's really about who's in the room when you're sort of thinking things through. So, visiting a lab, seeing a particular, quite specific bit of science, and then thinking, how does that extrapolate into the real world, is very different from with that particular one. We had a whole day's workshop. We had an equal number of scientists, experts on different things like urban mental health, future of food, smart cities, whatever it was. We had the same number of residents, and the residents around Finsbury Park took us to their favourite spots. There was a very deliberate, we've all got something to contribute, because this was about celebrating 150 years of Finsbury Park. What's the next look like? And I think the difference with that one, and we've done some similar ones with young people, is where you're encouraging everybody in the room to also be thinking of story ideas. And then I took the ideas from everybody in the room, scientists and residents, and then wrote a story with some of those ideas in it. So it's different. It's actually, it's different. It's kind of exciting though, because you get to hear all sorts of perspectives and viewpoints that you just wouldn't think of. Like, somebody must have mentioned strawberries at some point for me to call it Long Live the Strawberries of Finsbury Park. I don't remember who.
Well, I know another project that you're both involved with is Cyber Salon. And Cyber Salon just did the 22 Ideas of the Future. I felt like I had to mention it because Ava was in my eyeline, and I'd never be forgiven if I didn't. That, again, has been in this iterative process of bringing experts in and different processes. I mean, if there was a lesson from that particular project, what would it be? So I think, and Christine interviewed the authors on the first book, and we talked to some of the experts that are involved. And I think the big lesson from the first book we did is people want to be involved with each other sooner. Yeah. So we're just starting a second book. Me and Ben's over there is editing it with me. We're just starting a second book, and what we're doing there is we've put out a call for authors, not stories, and we're getting the authors and the experts talking before stories even exist, which is, from an editor's point of view, it's quite scary because you don't actually know what the story's going to look like. So there's been an amount of trust, but actually I think it's really paying dividends, because the quality of the conversations at the point somebody's thinking about what they're going to write is good to have earlier rather than commenting on a draft. Do you think that's an important thing, Christine, with people coming in with either pre-expectations or pre-stories, getting them to start from ground zero and work on something collaboratively together?
But that's, I find it super interesting, because that clearly came out of the interviews I made with the authors, that one of the things they loved most was this interaction with the experts, and they want more of it. And as much as possible, and they also love the curated material you were providing. Like, we don't have to research, so this is absolutely brilliant. But the idea of having not pre-written stories is basically what we are doing when I'm taking Stephen or other authors, because someone would take Geoff as well to the neuroscientific fly labs and stuff like that, to with no pre-written stories, just taking the authors in the labs and see what comes out of it. So I find it quite exciting.
Well, I love how that process becomes this idea of having a science fiction author in residence. And I know this residency piece is kind of key to the digital psychiatry project. Christine, could you just explain what that project is?
Gosh, I've got the expert in the room.
So don't mess it up.
Well, it's a project. I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible and not say too many stupid stuff. Let's just say that there is a bunch of data at King's that Helen is looking after, which was constituted over 18 years with a cohort of twins that were born between around 1990. 4 or 5, from their birth, about a bit over 2,200 kids, so 1,100 pairs of twins, if I have it right. And they were studied from age 0 until age 18. And among the various points in time where they were, studied in all sorts of dimensions, when they were age 5, researchers went in their homes, interviewed their moms about their pretty much open questions about, their kids, talk about their kids. And that was recorded. And then there was some human coders who were specially trained to listen to these interviews and evaluate the level of emotions expressed by the mothers towards each of their twins. The intensity of the emotion and whether it was positive or negative, and they wanted to use this evaluation to see if it could be used as a predictor of future mental health outcomes and issues arising when the kids reached adolescence, which they could check because they also saw the kids until they were 18. What the project of digital psychiatry is doing now is assembling the initial people who collected this data with specialists in natural language processing, in various aspects of artificial intelligence, to try to use these original data to develop tools that could automate the interpretation of and level of emotions held in carers' speech towards kids to try to predict later outcomes as a tool, another tool to help clinicians who are involved with kids and young people for mental health questions to some diagnostics. So that's, a little bit, not too bad.
So these are the sorts of environments that you find yourself in. And then once you made heads or tails of that, I mean, how does stepping through the door turn into, I think it was two stories for this one?
So, and this is a great one in terms of, it's been over quite a long time. So we've already been in the project for a year. I think there's another couple of years to go. But so joining in project team meetings, I did to start off with. I'm sure Helen will forgive me. They're quite boring because it's like, well, it's like, oh, they won't give us enough computer time, this university. How do we do this? So, very administrative in a lot of ways because they're weekly meeting, as team meetings are. But it's still interesting from my point of view to kind of be reminded that this is like real people doing real jobs that carry all that kind of stuff. But then we did workshops started sort of formulating some ideas, interviewed each of the project team members, both the clinical psychologists and the AI people individually, started to get a shape of things, then ran some of the ideas, these are the themes that I'm kind of picking up, ran that by them. We had workshops with young people, with clinical psychologists, others outside the project, and gradually formed these two stories, and then with those we went into public events to read them and then have a kind of engagement, I guess, public engagement with audiences. So it's over quite a long period of time, and they're quite. What I think what that process and that in depth has allowed me to do is be probably more nuanced than a quick short burst into somewhere and out. So, it's good.
Well, Christine, we both know that the thing that matters in academia is impact. And when you turn around to these projects and go, I want to bring a science fiction author in, is one of those questions you get, well, how do we measure the impact of having that sort of activity, and have you cracked that nut yet?
No. To be fair, I haven't. I haven't cracked it, but
perhaps maybe anecdotally, have you seen the impact that it's had perhaps on the scientists?
We have seen it on scientists. We have seen it on scientists, notably, when we were working with the Bristol Robotics Lab, because once the experiment was over, we actually, myself, I was the one interviewing the scientist, and Michael was the one interviewing the authors. So I went and interviewed the scientists from the Bristol Robotics Lab who had participated in the event, And it was very interesting to see how some of their ideas had evolved. One thing that was interesting was that the people participating in this project, the Bristol Robotics Lab, there were clearly people who were, most of them already into science fiction, loved it since they were kids or whatever, and were already convinced by the value of public engagement and finding new ways of doing public engagement. So that it was preaching to the converted. I was not going to take scientists who are dead against engaging with the public. That was never going to work. But even though these people were some of them were already very experienced in this area, it still changed the ways they were looking at science fiction, for instance. Like one of the main, very seasoned professor of robotics, who's a lifelong reader of science fiction, said that after engaging with us and our project, instead of, it's always been too hard science fiction, reading a lot of things about interstellar travels and galaxy things and stuff, and became very interested in actually more social science fiction and near future science fiction, and could see the value it was bringing on imagining, kind of sociological dimension and political dimension of things. And it completely changed what he was reading, basically, because I interviewed him 6 months after the project, and he was in an entire different phase of reading very different stuff. And since by his own, he said, the other thing he had realized that, okay, it's like science fiction is a what-if experiment. And I realized, working with you, that then I'm making this what-if happen in my lab. So you can infer that if he changes the kind of readings he does by reading other kinds of what-if scenarios, he's going to do different things in his lab. But how do you measure that for a kind of impact for a ref exercise for anyone who is an academic who knows what a ref exercise is? This is not happening. I mean, this is not quantifiable. But we know we have an impact on some of the people who work with us.
Well, are you seeing some
happily?
Glad it's happily. Are you seeing some of those anecdotal stories? Are you having the scientists come up to you afterwards and tell things maybe secretly in your ear that maybe you can or can't share with us?
I don't know if they're secret. So with the Cyber Salon book that you mentioned, so there's a couple of people that have been involved in those. They've basically said it's prompted them and pushed them to take a bit of a step back to think about things more broadly and more longer term in terms of what they're up to. And I've noticed that talking to scientists when we sort of do these projects, that you can kind of get the questions you're asking, and you can see that you're sort of helping them come out of that, I need to fix the most immediate problem in my very specialized field, to, okay, how does this all work? So I think, there's that. That's the kind of anecdotal stuff that I've picked up.
Ask me again in a year. Because for this round of Cyber Salon short stories, instead of interviewing the authors, I'm going to interview the experts. So I will know why they participate in the first place and what they took out of it. So hopefully I may know a bit more.
Well, Stephen, as you were speaking there, I was furiously checking my email for the schedule and I couldn't find it. But are we going to audience questions now, or are we going to come back?
So we've got a couple of audience questions, because I just want some hands up. We're gonna do a little mini thing that me and Christine have done with the AI and mental health project. So we've got 3 questions I'm going to ask you, and you don't think too hard about them. Right? So I've done this, and I've had people say, well, I don't know because you haven't told me enough about X, Y, and Z. It's like, I know, I get it. This is almost instinctive rather than thought through. So just putting all that to rest now. So there's 3 questions, and they're yes, no, don't know answers. So it's just hands up. I'm then going to read one of the stories from the project, and I'm going to ask you the same questions again, and we'll see. And then we're into audience Q&A.
Wonderful. Well, before we go, before we leave the stage to let you read another story, are there any projects coming up where you're looking for collaborators? Is there anything on the horizon where folks who may have heard about this thing called applying science fiction, they want to get involved?
So there's always stuff bubbling around. So if anyone wants to get involved, just get in touch. Some of the sort of more concrete ones, I guess, that are coming through. I'm working with a company called Too Simple, we're looking at a writing competition for 11-year-olds. What we're hoping to do is take some academic work from places like King's, or probably from King's, turn it into 11-year-old friendly material, which will prompt those 11-year-olds to write about their future. So I'm really looking forward to that if we manage to pull that off. We've got another couple of years to go of that project as well, the Cyber Salon book. And there's some inklings of something going on in Germany, but I don't know exactly what yet.
All right, well, there's on that note of inklings going on in Germany, you are a science fiction author through and through. You created the suspense for us, and we'll have to see what happens. I hope you'll just quickly please join me in thanking both Christine and Stephen.